Hello, and a warm welcome to today's online intelligence briefing examining the current state of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. My name is Reed Foster, and I'm the Military Capabilities Analyst for the Middle East, and I'll be presenting today's session. The content for today's briefing is primarily coming from a variety of contents across the Jane's spectrum of products. I do want to highlight that today's is particularly drawn from the Jane's Military and Security Assessment section. We'll just look initially at the IRGC, sort of segmenting it into past, present, and future looks, and then wrap up with a bit of conclusions. The origins of the IRGC will be discussed alongside the force structure and organization to kind of lay the landscape for the organization. We'll move through that pretty quickly, as many of you are probably aware of the foundations of the IRGC, but we'll spend quite a bit more time on the present, looking at the key threats that the IRGC faces, sort of its place in conflict and opportunity, and its ability to exploit conflict in the last 10 years to advance some of its strategic aims. And then take a couple of case studies highlighting the IRGC's involvement in Syria, Yemen, and the Gulf. Finally, looking at the future cast, the aspirations and objectives that the IRGC has, and then just wrapping up with some conclusions. Now, I've entitled this presentation Back to the Future, and that's mostly looking at where the IRGC started, its origins, and sort of where it finds itself now. So it's a bit of an odd title, but it's not so much to evoke Marty McFly and Doc Brown, but to emphasize the IRGC's rather particular approach to warfare. Due to the organization's political influence and its status, it's basically been given free rein to develop its own tactics and doctrine to support the defense of the Islamic Republic and the general ideals of the revolution. The doctrine has been tempered by both history and the economic realities that Iran has found itself in the past 40 years, and the impact that the revolution has had in its standing within the international community. More on that in a moment. The IRGC was born, of course, out of the crucible of the 1979 revolution and was intended originally as a counterpoint to the military, whose loyalties at the time were suspect and were going through a series of purges of some of the higher ranking officials within the armed forces who were originally loyal to the Shah. But in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the IRGC acted as a bit of a mainstay, acting as the primary defense against Iraqi aggression in the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War. The IRGC was pressed into service with the Iraqi advance, and the weakened state of the army meant that organizationally they were quite separate in the type of operations they were conducting. And therefore, Iraq was able to exploit in the early phases of the war some of this disorganization. However, the IRGC did, especially in the early phases, provide a spirited defense and strategically withdrawing some of the territory that was lost in the early phases of the war. That's largely from the IRGC's role in this conflict that the organization was transformed from a loosely confederate group of paramilitary organizations into a more homogenous military and political force that it later became. It also emerged out of this conflict with a credible claim that it did play a major part in not only preserving the revolution, but the Iranian state itself. In some ways, that hasn't really changed. The IRGC remains considered the defenders of the revolution, and its ideological ties to the revolution and also the supreme leader make it somewhat inseparable from the state, and it's gone to great lengths to ensure that that's been the case. Furthermore, it's emerged as a major military and political force using its influence to establish business interests in Iran, spanning from manufacturing to property development, and also taking advantage of the country's shift to a more conservative political spectrum in the mid to late 2000s under the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad regime. Now, from this point, James assesses that the IRGC's role and influence in the government has only continued to grow for the last decade, as the instability within the Gulf, stemming from originally the Arab Spring, but then following on through the Syrian civil war and the rise of Islamic State and later fall of Islamic State. But all this instability has created a new era for the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf region, and one that Iran very much looks forward to playing a more increasingly prominent role. And just sort of encapsulating sort of some of the activities in Syria. Here again, Iranian commanders and specialists from the IRGC have been deployed to Syria since around 2013. We can track, but we believe that the IRGC has been present in Syria to some extent for much longer than that within their support network to Lebanon. Next, we'll look a little bit into Yemen. Here again, this is another covert support. There's not been confirmed Iranian support, but a lot of the evidence is quite apparent in some of the new equipment that the Houthi rebel forces have been displaying and sort of calling their own in their own developments, but bear striking resemblance and are likely beyond the engineering capabilities of the Houthi forces. Here we see on the right side, we see a Burkhan 2H on the very far right. And then on the left, the tan missile there is the IRGC's Qiyam 1. Wrapping up a little bit, we've covered a kind of an overview of it in some of the areas where the IRGC has operated and looked a little bit into the future about what that might mean. But overall, I think the IRGC has ultimately made quite significant strides in developing its military capabilities and increasing its influence both in the Gulf, but extending into the Eastern Mediterranean as well. Having those bases established in Syria is a quite significant step for Iran, who has been fairly insular and concerned only with territorial defense for many decades following the Islamic Revolution of '79, and is now actually able to more openly and overtly support those causes for which it supports, and with the Syrian regime enjoying more and more success in Syria and the Russian support of Syria, there is an opportunity here for Iran, led by the IRGC, by the opportunities made by the IRGC, to enter into a new phase of its international relations. Conflicts over the past decade have further enabled the IRGC to refine its concepts of operations abroad, taking into account some of the losses that they had to incur, especially in Syria. But the conflicts have been a fantastic learning opportunity for the IRGC to look at what works, what doesn't. I do thank you that have stuck with me and taken the time to listen to this presentation. And I hope you're able to join us for future briefings. Our next briefing will focus on the intrepid world of submarines and a presentation daringly entitled Conventional Submarines, Developments and Markets. Once again, thank you for your time and attention. Goodbye.